June 1941, Smolensk Province. The earth was dry and the air shimmered with heat. Nikolai was 23, a farmer's son who had never left his village. The mobilization order came like thunder rolling across the steppe. Red papers nailed to wooden fences, the seal of the Soviet Union stamped over every household name. He had been proud to go. The whole village came to see the young men off, standing along the dirt road that led to the station. His mother pressed a small silver cross into his palm, forbidden but old, and whispered, "It's not for God, Kolya. It's for memory." He laughed, embarrassed, and closed his hand around it. The train that took him west was filled with voices, jokes, songs about Stalin and the motherland. They believed the war would be short. The officers said the Germans would be driven back in weeks. In his kit bag, Nikolai carried a loaf of black bread, a letter from his younger sister, and a photograph of the family horse. The night before crossing the Dnieper, the men camped under birch trees. The smell of sap and tobacco hung in the air. Someone played a mouth organ, soft and uneven. The war still seemed distant then, an idea, not yet a sound. Nikolai wrote in his pocket diary, "I will come back before the harvest." When the first air raid came, it was not like in the newsreels. There was no heroism, only the ripping sound of bombs and the sky tearing open. Columns scattered, horses screamed, dust mixed with gun oil and fear. He saw his company commander's face covered in blood, still giving orders no one could hear. By evening, the radio was silent. The maps no longer made sense. The next day, they retreated eastward, every village burning behind them. The men spoke little. They drank water from ditches, chewed raw wheat, and watched the horizon for the enemy that never seemed to tire. Nikolai carried his rifle, but it felt heavier each day, not from weight, but from the question growing inside him. What happens if we lose? In those early weeks, he learned how quickly certainty dies. Propaganda posters had shown the German as a faceless machine, but the prisoners they captured in a brief skirmish looked like boys, thin, afraid, speaking a language he couldn't hate. The first time he saw one bleed, he felt pity and then shame for feeling it. At night, he lay awake listening to the forest insects and the far-off thud of artillery. He thought of the farm, the smell of hay, his mother's voice calling the cows at dusk. He would close his eyes and imagine her lighting the stove, the way the flame would flare and settle. That image became his protection. By August, the Red Army was breaking. The lines bent and snapped. Columns dissolved into crowds. In the confusion, orders were lost, and hope followed. When he stumbled upon a burned village near Roslavel, he saw the first civilians caught in between, women moving silently among the ruins, faces blank as if they had run out of fear. He understood then that war was not movement but stillness, the stillness after destruction, the moment when no one knows which way to run. In the last entry of his diary before capture, the handwriting trembled. We are told to hold the line, but the line is smoke. That was the world before, a world where he still believed that survival and honor could coexist. The sun had been bright then, and no one believed it could end so soon. September 1941. Near Smolensk, the order to hold came late, carried by a runner whose boots were split at the toes. He saluted breathless and repeated the words as if saying them fast enough could make them true. The company dug in along a hedgerow that had once marked a farm boundary. The soil was easy at first, then full of stones. Shovels struck flint with a sound like teeth chattering. The morning smelled of damp earth and singed straw. A thin mist clung to the ground, Over it, the tree line wavered as if seen through water. Nikolai checked his rifle, fingers stiff from a night without sleep. Beside him, a boy from Tula whispered the Lord's Prayer under his breath, then coughed as if to erase it. Artillery found them just after sunrise. The first shells fell long, groping, then walked back with method. Nikolai felt the air harden around him, then tear. Dirt lifted and came down as rain. Somewhere to the left, a horse screamed once, high and final. When he dared look up, the hedgerow had become a row of blackened spikes. He tasted grit and the iron of his own lip. The lieutenant crawled along the line, hat gone, hair plastered to his skull. "Aim low," he said to no one in particular. Short bursts. "Conserve." His mouth worked around the words like they were heavier than his tongue. He moved on. Then the gray shapes came through the mist. Not many at first, then more, spaced, crouching, rifles steady. The machine gun to Nikolai's right chattered, then jammed. The gunner cursed, slammed the cover, cursed again. The Germans were closer. He could see their faces now, pale, set, eyes narrow against the drift of smoke. Nikolai fired. The butt kicked his shoulder. The sight leapt. He worked the bolt, fired again. He did not know if he hit anyone. The line held for a minute that felt like an hour. Then the left flank folded, not from fear but from vacancy. There were simply fewer men standing there each time he blinked. The lieutenant shouted to refuse the flank. No one moved. The boy from Tula rose to run a message and spun down as if the ground had reached up for him. The radio crackled, then went to a steady, indifferent hum. The runner lay face down by the set, antenna angled like a broken reed. Someone yelled, "Back! Back!" The word became contagious. Nikolai looked for the lieutenant and saw him kneeling, head bowed, as if tying a bootlace. When he lifted his face, his eyes were flat with a kind of practical sorrow. He lifted his hand, forward or back, Nikolai couldn't tell, and then a shell took the rest of the sentence. The line broke in segments like ice shearing on a river. Men ran because the space in front had become narrower than the space behind. Nikolai ran too, legs heavy, rifle slapping his back. The field that had been a position became a passageway, churned and slick. He lost his cap and did not stop for it. They reached a sunken road and poured along it, packed tight, the smell of sweat and cordite and raw fear blending until it was only one thing. A mule cart jammed the way. Men climbed over it, the animal's eyes wide and stupid with terror. Someone fired behind them to slow the shapes that were no longer mist but men. The road bent toward a stand of birch, white trunks repeating like a warning. At the bend, the crowd stalled. Ahead, a German half-track blocked the cut, its gun resting merely present. From the trees on both sides, rifles spoke in sharp, clipped syllables. An officer in field gray stepped up onto the roadbed and motioned with a pistol, not to fire but to stop. His face was young, almost pretty. He shouted a few words in Russian. "Hands up! Enough!" There is a particular silence when men decide they can no longer be soldiers. It doesn't come all at once. A man lowers his rifle to rest his arms, just for a moment. Another takes a breath and doesn't raise his weapon again. Someone drops to his knees, ostensibly to retie a binding, and does not rise. The silence collects around these small acts until it is large enough to stand in. Nikolai felt it pass over him like a cold front. He did not remember choosing. He remembered only the weight of the rifle becoming unbearable, as if it were made of the days ahead. He set it down with care as he would set down a child fallen asleep on his shoulder, his hands lifted, stupidly careful, like a man learning a new tool. The Germans moved among them, efficient, not unkind, collecting weapons, pointing men to the ditch where they were to sit, 5 abreast. A canteen appeared, a cigarette, a word spoken without emphasis. A Feldwebel walked past, touching shoulders lightly as if counting sheep. In the ditch, the boy from Tula lay on his side, eyes open to nothing. Nikolai closed them with 2 fingers and wiped his hand on his trousers without thinking. A shadow fell. A German stood over him, then crouched and offered a tin cup. Water sloshed against the lip. Nikolai took it and drank. The taste was metallic and cold. Somewhere, an NKVD commissar's poster said that surrender was treason. The words did not arrive here. What arrived was the creak of leather, the click of safety catches, the dull thud of boots on packed earth. He was cold, though the day was mild. On the roadside, his company's red banner lay tangled in thorns, the cloth dark with mud. He could not say when it had fallen. The wind lifted one corner and let it fall again, as if practicing a salute. By evening, the column of prisoners formed, 2 by 2, hands on heads. A German truck led, another followed. They were given numbers they could not keep and warned not to talk. As the line stepped off, Nikolai glanced back once toward the hedgerow that had been their line. Smoke rose in steady ropes. The sun lowered behind it, the light turning the smoke to copper. He understood that something had been decided about him that he had not decided. The fracture was not only in the line but in the story he thought he was living. The road went west. His thoughts stayed east. They walked until the sky lost its edges, and the first night of captivity began not with a door closing, but with the simple fact of not stopping. Winter 1942, Lübeck region, northern Germany. The first thing Nikolai learned was to forget the calendar. In captivity, the days came without names, only temperatures. The frost began at the nails, then the breath, until even hunger felt like something frozen. The camp was a ring of barbed wire and frost-bitten quiet. Beyond the wire stood pine trees that never moved. Guards in gray coats paced between towers, boots crunching the same pattern day after day. Inside, men lived by barter, a crust of bread for a threadbare mitten, a German word for a spoonful of soup. They slept on wooden tiers, shoulder to shoulder, breathing into each other's rags for warmth. The smell never left. Straw, sweat, boiled cabbage, and rust. At dawn, a whistle split the air. The only clock they had. Roll call, soup, labor, roll call again. Beneath the monotony lay the hidden work of staying human. Nikolai learned to speak a few German words, enough to survive. One guard, Corporal Meissner, had a limp and a tired face. He sometimes looked away when the prisoners stole potato peels. To the others, that was a risk too great. To Nikolai, it was a conversation in silence. The Red Cross sent parcels sometimes, but rarely to the Russians. He saw British and French prisoners share cigarettes, books, even laughter. Their mail arrived, and they read letters under the weak light like men feeding on words. For the Soviets, there were no letters. The Soviet Union had declared them missing, not captured. In the eyes of Moscow, they did not exist. One night, after the guards passed, a prisoner from Minsk told a story about his wife, how she'd hidden potatoes under the floorboards before the Germans came. His voice cracked halfway through, and the men listened, not to the story, but to the sound of a man remembering. The silence after was warmer than the blanket. By 1943, the faces around Nikolai had changed. Some died quietly, others were taken out after roll call and never returned. He stopped asking where. Memory became a liability, every friend another ghost to carry. When an officer asked for a translator, someone who spoke German and Russian, Nikolai volunteered. It wasn't courage, it was calculation. He would be inside during the cold, near food scraps, near information. He began translating camp orders, interrogation notes, ration lists. The guards stopped seeing him as a prisoner and started seeing him as a tool. Yet even that survival carried its price. The others called him scribe, sometimes with respect, sometimes with bitterness. He pretended not to notice. The truth was that every kindness he received made him feel smaller. In the evenings, when work ended and men huddled around a tin stove, someone would hum an old marching song, soft, almost private. The sound of it twisted something in him. He remembered the birch trees of Smolensk, the smell of rye, the voice of his sister reading by candlelight. Memory became both shelter and punishment. By late 1944, they were skeletons in rags who still stood when counted. Rumors drifted through the wire. The Allies had landed in France. The Red Army was pushing west. Hope arrived as a rumor, too, and like all rumors, it made men reckless. That winter, Meissner gave Nikolai a piece of charcoal to write with. "For the records," he said. Nikolai kept it in his pocket for weeks before using it. On the inside wall of his bunk, he drew a small cross, then a date, December 24th. He did not know if it was still the right day, but he needed the illusion of a calendar again. When spring came, the guards began to burn documents. The air smelled of ink and ash. Planes passed overhead, distant thunder rolling eastward. One morning the loudspeakers stopped working. The guards whispered among themselves. Something was ending, and the prisoners could feel it like the tremor before a thaw. In the hush of that uncertain spring, Nikolai folded his ration paper into a small square and wrote 2 words in pencil stub: "I exist." He hid it under the floorboard, not for the Germans, not for the Soviets, but for proof that somewhere in the machinery of war, one man had refused to vanish. May 18, 1945, Bad Wurzach, Bavaria. The gates opened at dawn. No speeches, no flags, just the sound of a hinge turning and boots shuffling toward uncertainty. After years behind wire, freedom came without ceremony. The guards were gone, their watchtowers empty. Allied soldiers in clean uniforms walked through the mud with calm efficiency, pointing, counting, giving orders in English that few understood. Nikolai followed the others out, his body moving before his mind could grasp that he was free. A jeep rolled past, splashing water across his boots. The smell of gasoline, soap, and tobacco. The scent of another army, another world. One of the Americans, a young lieutenant with fair hair, smiled briefly as he handed out cigarettes. "You're going home," he said, as if the word home still meant the same thing. They were deloused, fed, photographed. The Allied officers spoke of repatriation, of coordination with Soviet liaison units. The word liaison sounded polite, bureaucratic. But among the prisoners, it had another weight. Rumors whispered that the Soviets were coming not to welcome, but to judge. That night, Nikolai could not sleep. The barracks felt too open, the air too rich. Men lay awake, staring at the ceiling, each imagining a different version of return. One whispered, "My mother will cry." Another, "They will ask why I lived." No one answered. 2 days later, Soviet officers arrived. They wore new uniforms, polished boots, the red star bright on their caps. Their faces were expressionless, as if carved from the same command. They spoke through translators, asking the same questions in the same order. When captured? How? Did you resist? Did you serve the enemy? Each answer was written in careful Cyrillic. Each silence was written, too. When it was Nikolai's turn, he stood straight. The major reading his file didn't look up. Private Sokolov, captured August 1941, Smolensk, translator for German command. Yes, Comrade Major. Translator for prisoner's orders. Voluntary? Nikolai hesitated. The pause lasted less than a second, but the pencil on the clipboard stopped moving. Sit, the major said quietly. You will be transported east for verification. The word verification chilled him more than winter ever had. Around him, men tried to argue, to plead. A sergeant wept openly. The officers didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their calm was more final than any scream. Outside, American soldiers watched, uncertain. One of them stepped forward, saying something about rights, about liberation. The Soviet major nodded, smiled thinly, and replied in German, "They are our citizens. We will take care of them." The convoy assembled at dusk. Trucks lined up, engines humming like insects. Each man received a small slip of paper, his pass for home. Some held it to their chests as if it were a passport to life. Nikolai folded his and put it in his shoe, where no one could read what it really was: permission to vanish. As the trucks rolled out of the camp, he looked back once. American soldiers stood by the gate, cigarettes glowing in their hands, their faces puzzled. One lifted a hand in farewell. Nikolai lifted his in return. It felt less like goodbye than confession. The road wound eastward. Through the slats of the truck, the world blurred. Fields, villages, rivers. Freedom passing in reverse. Every mile brought him closer to the border and farther from belief. In the darkness, someone whispered, "They will send us home." Someone else answered, "Home is gone." Nikolai said nothing. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the smell of his mother's stove, the sound of her voice calling him for supper. But all he could hear was the steady rhythm of the truck, the heartbeat of a system that did not know the difference between loyalty and luck. By morning, the trucks reached the railhead. A new line of guards waited, their uniforms familiar, their eyes colder than the German ones had ever been. A clipboard ticked, a gate opened, and freedom ended again. June 1945. The border at Brest-Litovsk. The train waited in silence, its cars marked only with chalked numbers. Steam hissed from beneath the wheels, rising into a sky the color of wet ash. To the west, the smoke of burned villages. To the east, the invisible line of home. The men boarded without orders. There were no shouts, no rifles forcing them, only that quiet, collective understanding that this was the next step in a journey they no longer controlled. The wooden doors slammed shut, locks clicked, a bolt scraped metal. The sound was clean, mechanical, final. Inside, there was barely room to sit. The air thickened within minutes, heavy with breath and damp wool. Someone began to pray softly. Someone else told him to stop. "They'll hear us," he said. No one asked who they were. Nikolai sat near a crack in the plank, watching the thin stripe of light shift as the train lurched forward. He counted the telegraph poles, then stopped when the rhythm became unbearable. At his feet, a man from Minsk coughed blood into his sleeve. Another whispered that this was not a transport home, but a filtration train, the kind that led to camps, not cities. When the sun rose, they passed through Poland. Outside, women swept rubble from streets where walls stood like teeth in broken gums. Children watched from doorways with eyes too old. The prisoners fell silent. They did not want to be seen, not by the living, not by the free. At a junction, the train stopped beside another. British soldiers in clean uniforms leaning from open cars, smoking. One of them tossed a cigarette toward Nikolai's side. It bounced against the plank and fell to the tracks. The Russian nearest the door stared at it until the train jolted again, leaving the ember behind. That night, The guards opened the doors at a siding. A Soviet lieutenant with frost-pale eyes walked the length of the train, clipboard in hand. "Names," he called. "Rank, date of capture." He wrote quickly, impassive. When someone hesitated, another soldier lifted a pistol slightly, just enough to remind them of gravity. When it came to Nikolai's turn, he spoke calmly, but his voice cracked on his own name. The lieutenant didn't notice, or pretended not to. He ticked the list and moved on. Behind him, a younger guard handed out ladles of thin soup from a bucket. It was warm, salty. Men took it with shaking hands. One whispered, "Maybe they will let us go." Later, when the train began moving again, someone at the far end tried to open a door. A click, then a shout, then the scream of metal tearing from wood. The cold wind rushed in. For a second, stars flooded the car. Real stars, clean and indifferent. A figure leapt into the dark. There was a pause, then a single gunshot. No one spoke after. The door was slammed shut and bolted. Nikolai pressed his forehead against the wall. He felt the vibration of the wheels like a second heartbeat. His mind split between two impossible instincts, to run or to endure. Running meant death. Enduring meant disappearance. Somewhere between the two lived what remained of him. He remembered a summer day before the war, the smell of hay after rain, the way lights slid over the Dnieper like oil. That memory returned now, not as comfort, but as proof that he had once belonged to a world where life was still a choice. By dawn, the train had crossed into Soviet territory. The guards changed, now all wearing the Red Star. They did not speak to the prisoners. They did not need to. Their silence carried the weight of verdict. The wheels slowed. A wooden sign flashed by, Vorkuta. Nikolai closed his eyes. The train did not stop. It only remembered the direction of fear. Winter 1946, Camp 283, Vorkuta, Komi Republic. The cold had its own language. It spoke in cracks, the snapping of wood, the frozen breath of men who forgot to exhale. Every sound in that camp was short, as if words themselves froze before they finished. Nikolai no longer counted the days. The guards did that for him on papers he would never see. The mornings began with a whistle and the thud of boots outside the barrack door. Prisoners stumbled out, heads low, coats crusted with frost. They moved like a single body, one that had learned to bend but not to break. Work meant digging, hauling, lifting. Snow over coal, coal over snow. The rhythm replaced thought. In the evenings, soup came in tin bowls, thin as breath. The strongest always ate first. The rest waited without bitterness because anger was too heavy to carry in the cold. He shared his bunk with 3 others. One was a teacher from Leningrad who recited Pushkin under his breath as if poems were rations. Another was a mechanic from Kharkov who dreamed of machines still whole and clean. The third, a lieutenant, never spoke. His eyes had the look of someone still waiting for orders from a command that no longer existed. The NKVD interrogations came in waves. Each week, the same questions. Did you collaborate? Did you inform? Did you speak to Germans? Every answer was written, then rewritten. The same names appeared on new lists. Some men disappeared afterward. Others returned silent like rooms with the furniture removed. When Nikolai's turn came, the officer behind the desk was young, no older than he had been when captured. The man's pen hovered. "You were a translator," he said. "That means you worked for them." "I translated orders for prisoners, not the Germans." "They were Germans." Nikolai said nothing. The officer looked at him for a long moment, then signed a paper and said, "Verification incomplete. Remain under supervision." No sentence, no release, just existence. That was the worst punishment, to live without conclusion. Weeks passed. The light never changed, just paled and hardened. He learned to mend torn gloves, to make tea from pine needles, to listen for the whistle that meant rest. Small mercies became survival. One evening during roll call, a guard dropped his notebook in the snow. Without thinking, Nikolai picked it up and handed it back. The guard nodded. Not thanks, not friendship, only acknowledgement. But it was enough to remind him that humanity could still flicker even here, like a candle shielded from wind. Later, that same guard, a young man from Kazan, asked Nikolai to write a letter for him. His Russian was poor, his handwriting worse. "To my daughter," he said. "She is 6. I don't know what to say." Nikolai took the pencil and began to write. "My dear Katya, I hope the snow in Kazan is kind to you this winter. I am working far away, but I think of you when I see the stars." When he finished, the guard folded the letter carefully and left without a word. That night, Nikolai lay awake, staring at the frost that crept along the window frame. For the first time in years, he realized he had spoken tenderness again, even if through someone else's mouth. Spring came slowly, as it always did in the north. The snow turned gray, then mud. Trucks arrived carrying new prisoners, soldiers, peasants, engineers, anyone who had survived in the wrong way. Rumors said the war was long over, that Moscow was rebuilding, that medals were being handed out in Red Square. Here, only the wind saluted. One morning, a notice appeared on the board outside the command hut. Certain prisoners to be reassigned or released. He found his number listed in pencil, faint, almost uncertain. No date, no explanation, just a line through his name. Not erased, only crossed. He folded the notice in half and kept it inside his coat. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't justice, but it was the first proof in years that someone, somewhere, had remembered he existed. That night, he sat by the stove and whispered to the teacher from Leningrad, "If they let me go, I'll go home and find my mother's grave, that's all." The teacher nodded. "Then you will have lived twice." The stove crackled outside. The wind moved over the wire, humming softly, like breath caught between despair and mercy. In that sound, Nikolai thought he heard the world beginning to thaw. Smolensk, 1975. The apartment was small and clean, built after the thaw, when Khrushchev had promised a new life of order and concrete. The radio on the windowsill hummed with static before finding a marching band. The Victory Day parade had begun. Nikolai sat by the window, hands folded over his knees. The medals pinned to his coat were not his. They belonged to others. Friends gone, comrades who had marched home the right way, through the Red Square and not the rail yards of Vorkuta. He wore them because people expected it, because it was easier than explaining why he had none. Outside, children waved paper flags. The tanks on television gleamed in the May sun. Commentators spoke of glory, sacrifice, unbroken courage, words that once meant something, now hollowed by time and repetition. He reached to turn the volume down. The band's trumpets faded until only the sound of the wind through the courtyard trees remained. That was the noise he preferred, the small, human one. On the wall hung a single photograph, his mother in a headscarf, standing in front of the old house. The image was from before the war, before the world decided who was guilty and who was not. He looked at it each morning as if to confirm he had not imagined her. There were years he never spoke of. The train, the camp, the way the guards' faces blurred into one another until he could no longer tell which army they belonged to. His wife, long dead now, had once asked, "What was it like when you came home?" He had answered truthfully, "It wasn't home that I found. It was silence." In the early 60s, the state had cleared his record. Rehabilitated, the paper said. A word that sounded clean but tasted like dust. It meant he could work again, draw a pension, receive a ration card. It did not mean they would believe him. Sometimes at night he walked down to the river. The Dnieper moved quietly under the bridge, the water black and slow. He would lean on the railing, feeling the chill through his hands, and imagine that the current carried voices, the ones who had not returned, calling softly through the years. He never answered. The living should not speak to the dead. He had learned that memory, if spoken too loudly, became disbelief, so he let it settle, like silt in the bottom of a glass. Now the television showed faces, veterans, proud and aged, saluting under banners. The camera panned across rows of medals shining like small suns. He watched, unmoved, until one old soldier lifted his hand with a gesture so familiar that it stopped him. A small, precise motion, a wave from the elbow, not the wrist, the way POWs used to signal to each other across the wire when guards weren't looking. For a moment, Nikolai's breath caught. The old man on the screen might have been one of them, one of the forgotten. But the camera moved on, and the face vanished into the crowd. He turned the set off. The room returned to its true light. Gray, honest. In the silence that followed, he heard the faint tick of the kitchen clock, the soft crackle of the radio cooling. Time, steady and unremarkable, finally his to waste. He stood, walked to the window, and opened it. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of wet earth. Somewhere below, a boy ran with a flag made from a red scarf tied to a stick. It fluttered once, bright against the sky. Nikolai watched until the child disappeared around the corner. Then he sat down again and folded his hands. The war had ended long ago, but the return never did. Thousands of Soviet soldiers returned home from German captivity only to face suspicion, silence, or exile. Their stories were buried beneath the language of victory, until witnesses like Nikolai forced us to remember the cost of survival itself. If this story moved you, let it breathe. Share it so that silence does not win again. Subscribe to War Without Glory for more true accounts of the men and women who lived where history forgot to look.